7-year-old Emma Martinez had always been the kind of child who collected moments like other kids collected toys. She would stop to watch butterflies land on flowers, spend hours building elaborate sandcastles that she knew the waves would wash away, and ask her mother endless questions about why the sky changed colors at sunset. Her dark curls bounced when she walked, and her laugh had a musical quality that made strangers smile even on their worst days. The Martinez family lived in a modest apartment 3 blocks from the Children's Hospital in London, though they had never imagined they would become so familiar with its sterile corridors and the gentle hum of medical equipment. Emma's father, Carlos, worked 2 jobs to support the family, cleaning office buildings at night and delivering packages during the day. Her mother, Sofia, had put her nursing degree on hold to care for Emma and her younger brother, Miguel, who was only 4 and still believed that superheroes lived in their apartment walls. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March when Emma woke up with what her parents thought was just another childhood fever. She had been tired for weeks, complaining that her legs hurt after playing, and Sofia had noticed unusual bruises appearing on Emma's arms and legs. As a former nursing student, Sofia felt an uncomfortable knot in her stomach, but she pushed the worry away. Children got sick. Children got better. That was how the world was supposed to work. But when Emma's fever spiked to 104 degrees and she became so weak she could barely lift her head from her pillow, Carlos and Sofia knew something was seriously wrong. They wrapped their daughter in her favorite blanket, a soft pink one covered with dancing unicorns that her grandmother had made, and rushed to the emergency room of the nearby Children's Hospital. The emergency room was chaos that morning. A construction accident had brought in several injured workers, and the waiting room was packed with worried families. Emma lay curled in her mother's lap, her usually bright eyes now dull with exhaustion. Carlos paced the small waiting area, checking his watch every few minutes and asking the receptionist when they would be seen. Hours passed before a young doctor with kind eyes and tired shoulders finally called Emma's name. Dr. Sarah Chen had been working in pediatric emergency medicine for 5 years, but she still felt her heart clench every time she saw a child as sick as Emma clearly was. The little girl's pale skin, the way she struggled to keep her eyes open, and the scattered bruising on her thin arms all painted a picture that Dr. Chen recognized with growing dread. She conducted her examination with gentle hands, asking Emma questions about her favorite animals and her best friends at school while she listened to her heart and felt for swollen lymph nodes. The blood work results came back 2 hours later, and Dr. Chen had to step into a supply closet to collect herself before returning to the Martinez family. The numbers on the lab report told a story she had delivered too many times before, but it never got easier. Emma's white blood cell count was dangerously high, her red blood cell count was critically low, and the shape of the cells under the microscope confirmed what Dr. Chen had feared from the moment she first saw the exhausted little girl. When Dr. Chen returned to the examination room, she found Carlos holding Emma while Sofia stroked her daughter's hair and whispered stories about the magical adventures they would have when she felt better. The doctor pulled up a chair and sat down at eye level with the family, knowing that the next few minutes would divide their lives into before and after. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire, visible and choking and impossible to ignore. Dr. Chen explained that it was a type of blood cancer, that Emma's bone marrow was producing too many abnormal white blood cells, and that they would need to start treatment immediately. She used gentle words and drew pictures on a piece of paper, showing how the healthy cells were being crowded out by the sick ones, but Carlos and Sofia heard only fragments through their shock. Sofia's first instinct was to gather Emma in her arms and run, as if she could outpace the diagnosis by moving fast enough. Carlos asked the same question over and over, "Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure?" as if repetition might change the answer. Emma, still feverish and weak, looked between her parents and the doctor with confusion. She understood that something was very wrong, but at 7 years old, cancer was just a word adults used in hushed tones, not something that could live inside her own small body. The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and medical consultations. Emma was admitted to the pediatric oncology ward on the 4th floor of the hospital, a place that tried very hard to feel cheerful despite its serious purpose. The walls were painted in bright colors, and volunteers had hung artwork created by former patients, pictures of rainbow castles, smiling suns, and brave knights fighting dragons that looked suspiciously like medicine bottles. Emma's room was small but had a window that looked out over a courtyard where she could see other children playing when she felt strong enough to sit up. Sophia moved into the room with her daughter, sleeping on a narrow cot that the nurses provided, while Carlos continued working to maintain their health insurance and pay their bills. Miguel stayed with his Aunt Maria, who lived across the city and had 3 children of her own. Dr. Rebecca Williams, the head of pediatric oncology, took over Emma's care and explained that acute lymphoblastic leukemia was actually one of the more treatable forms of childhood cancer. With aggressive chemotherapy treatment, many children went into complete remission and lived normal, healthy lives. The treatment would be difficult and would take several years, but there was reason for hope. Emma would need to stay in the hospital for the first phase of treatment, which would last about a month. The chemotherapy began 3 days after Emma's admission. Sophia had read everything she could find about childhood leukemia in the hospital's Family Resource Center, and she thought she was prepared for what the treatment would do to her daughter. But watching Emma's hair begin to fall out in clumps, seeing her become nauseous after every meal, and witnessing her energy drain away like water through a broken dam was harder than any medical textbook could have prepared her for. Emma handled the physical changes with a stoicism that amazed the nursing staff. When her long, curly hair started coming out, she asked Sophia to help her cut it very short so it would be less messy when it fell out. She named her 4-pole Frederick and talked to it like a pet, telling it about her dreams and asking it to be gentle when the nurses moved it around. She created elaborate stories about the other children on the ward, imagining that they were all characters in a magical kingdom where brave warriors fought invisible enemies. But the hardest part for Emma was not seeing Miguel. The hospital had strict policies about sibling visits, especially for children under 5, because of infection risks. Miguel was too young to understand why his sister had disappeared, and the few times Carlos brought him to wave at Emma through her window, the little boy cried and asked why Emma couldn't come home. Emma would press her hand against the glass and tell Miguel stories through the window, but it broke her heart that she couldn't hug her little brother. After 2 weeks of treatment, Emma's energy levels had improved slightly, and she was allowed to spend time in the common areas of the pediatric ward when she felt up to it. That was where she first heard about the royal visit that was planned for the following month. Queen Elizabeth II was scheduled to visit the Children's Hospital as part of a series of public appearances supporting healthcare workers and young patients. The news created a buzz of excitement throughout the hospital. Nurses talked about which children might be selected to meet the Queen, and the activity therapists began planning special projects for the royal visit. Emma listened to all the discussions with growing excitement. She had always been fascinated by stories of queens and princesses, and the idea that a real queen might visit her hospital felt like something from one of the fairy tales her grandmother used to tell her. Sophia worried that Emma was getting her hopes up too high. The child was still very sick, and there was no guarantee she would be well enough to participate in any royal activities. But seeing the spark return to Emma's eyes when she talked about the possibility of meeting the Queen was the first genuinely happy moment Sophia had experienced since the diagnosis. Emma began planning what she would say if she had the chance to meet Queen Elizabeth. She practiced curtsying, even though the movement made her dizzy, and she asked Sophia to help her write a letter to the Queen about what it was like to be a child in the hospital. The letter was 3 pages long and included drawings of the various medical equipment in her room, each one labeled with the nickname Emma had given it. As the date of the royal visit approached, Emma's condition had stabilized somewhat. The initial phase of chemotherapy was showing positive results, and, while she was still weak and tired easily, she was no longer running fevers or requiring constant monitoring. Dr. Williams cautiously optimistic about Emma's response to treatment, though she reminded the family that they were still in the very early stages of what would be a long journey. The hospital administration began selecting which patients would have the opportunity to meet the Queen during her visit. The criteria included the child's current health status, their length of stay, and their ability to participate in a brief conversation. Emma's name was added to the preliminary list, and when Sophia told her daughter the news, Emma's face lit up with a joy that hadn't been seen since before her diagnosis. But protocol and reality were about to collide in ways that no one at the hospital could have anticipated. The royal visit was carefully choreographed, with specific timing, designated meeting areas, and strict security requirements. Children who were selected to meet the Queen would need to be in a particular location at a specific time, and there would be little flexibility in the schedule. 3 days before the royal visit, Emma had a setback. A routine blood test showed that her white blood cell count had spiked again, and she developed a fever that required her to be placed in isolation as a precaution. Dr. Williams explained to Sophia and Carlos that Emma would not be able to participate in the royal visit, as she was too sick to leave her room and the isolation requirements made any kind of public interaction impossible. Emma took the news with quiet disappointment that was somehow worse than if she had cried or gotten angry. She simply nodded and asked if she could still write a letter to the Queen, even if she couldn't deliver it in person. Sophia's heart broke watching her 7-year-old daughter accept yet another loss with grace that seemed far too mature for her age. Meanwhile, preparations for the royal visit continued throughout the hospital. Security teams conducted sweeps of the building, hospital staff received briefings on protocol, and the children who would meet the Queen practiced their presentations. Emma watched the preparations from her isolated room, pressing her face against the window to see the maintenance workers hanging decorations in the corridor. The night before the Queen's visit, Emma couldn't sleep. Her fever had broken, but she was still confined to her room for another 24 hours as a precaution. She lay in her narrow hospital bed, looking out at the courtyard where maintenance crews were setting up barriers and security checkpoints. Sophia sat beside her, reading from a book of fairy tales, but Emma was too distracted to follow the stories. Neither Emma nor her family could have imagined that 24 hours later, their lives would intersect with the royal visit in a way that would change everything, not just for them, but for one particular member of the Queen's security detail who was about to make a decision that would define the rest of his career and teach an entire nation about the power of compassion over protocol. The morning of Queen Elizabeth II's visit to the Children's Hospital dawned grey and drizzly, typical London weather that seemed to match Emma's mood as she watched from her isolation room window. The security preparations had begun before sunrise, with black cars arriving in precise formations and men in dark suits walking the perimeter of the building with practiced efficiency. Emma had been awake since 5 in the morning, not because of her medication schedule, but because she couldn't stop thinking about what might have been. She imagined herself in the group of children who would meet the Queen, pictured herself curtsying the way she had practiced, and wondered if the Queen would have liked the letter she had written with its careful drawings of her four-pole Frederick and the brave princess who fought invisible dragons with medicine instead of swords. Sophia had tried to make the morning special despite their disappointment. She had brought Emma's favorite breakfast from the hospital cafeteria, chocolate chip pancakes that were barely sweet enough to tempt Emma's treatment-affected taste buds, and they had spent an hour working on a jigsaw puzzle of Buckingham Palace that one of the volunteers had brought. But Emma's attention kept drifting to the window and the growing activity outside. At 10:30 in the morning, the royal motorcade arrived with a precision that spoke to years of practiced coordination. Emma pressed her face against the glass and watched as a sleek black Bentley pulled up to the main entrance, flanked by police motorcycles and security vehicles. Even from 4 floors up, she could see the small figure in a bright blue coat and matching hat who emerged from the car with the assistance of her security detail. What Emma didn't know was that among the security personnel was a man whose life was about to change as dramatically as hers had when she received her diagnosis. Sergeant Major James Robertson was a 15-year veteran of the Queen's Guard, a man whose entire adult life had been built around precision, protocol, and unwavering duty to the crown. At 42 years old, he had served in 3 different royal households and had a reputation for being absolutely reliable in any situation. James Robertson was not supposed to be thinking about his own daughter as he walked through the security sweep of the Children's Hospital, but he couldn't help himself. His 8-year-old daughter, Lucy, lived with his ex-wife in Scotland, and he saw her only every other weekend due to his demanding schedule with the royal household. Lucy had always been healthy and active, a stark contrast to the pale, thin children he glimpsed through doorways as he conducted his security checks of the hospital corridors. The royal visit was proceeding exactly according to schedule. Queen Elizabeth moved through the designated areas of the hospital with her characteristic grace, speaking briefly with selected patients, meeting with doctors and administrators, and observing some of the hospital's specialized equipment. James maintained his position 3 steps behind and to the left of Her Majesty, his trained eyes constantly scanning for any potential security concerns while appearing relaxed and approachable to the families they encountered. In the pediatric oncology ward, the Queen spent nearly an hour meeting with 6 children who had been selected to represent the various treatment programs. Each child had been carefully prepared for the encounter, and the conversations followed a gentle but structured format that allowed the Queen to learn about their experiences while keeping the interaction manageable for children who were dealing with serious illnesses. James watched these interactions with professional detachment, but something was shifting inside him as he observed the Queen's genuine warmth with the young patients. Her Majesty had a remarkable ability to make each child feel like they were the most important person in the room, asking thoughtful questions about their drawings, their favorite subjects in the hospital school, and their plans for when they went home. One particular conversation caught James's attention. 10-year-old Marcus, who had been receiving treatment for brain cancer for 6 months, had prepared a presentation about what he called his warrior medicine. With the help of his art therapist, he had created a poster showing how chemotherapy worked, depicting his cancer cells as tiny dragons and his treatment as knights on horseback. The Queen studied his artwork carefully and asked several questions that showed she was genuinely interested in understanding his perspective on his treatment. After the formal meetings concluded, the royal party began their walk back toward the main entrance. The visit had been a success by all measurable standards. The Queen had spent the allocated time with the selected patients, the media had captured positive images of royal support for children's healthcare, and security had maintained perfect control throughout the event. But, as they passed the isolation ward, something unexpected happened. James heard singing. The voice was small and sweet, clearly belonging to a young child, and it was coming from behind one of the doors marked with isolation protocols that meant no visitors were allowed inside. The song was "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," sung in a voice that was thin with illness but pure with hope. The royal party continued walking according to schedule, but James found himself slowing his pace, straining to hear the lyrics that seemed to float through the sterile hospital corridor. Emma had been singing to herself as a way to pass the time and keep her spirits up. She had learned the song from a music therapy session and found that singing helped distract her from the nausea that still came in waves even when her other symptoms had improved. She had no idea that anyone could hear her through the door, and she certainly had no idea that her voice was reaching the ears of someone who would soon change everything for her. James Robertson made a decision that went against every principle of his professional training. As the royal party continued toward the elevator, he quietly stepped aside and approached the nursing station. His movement was so subtle that most people didn't notice, and those who did assumed he was conducting a final security check of the area. "Excuse me," he said quietly to the nurse on duty, a middle-aged woman named Patricia who had been working in pediatric oncology for over 20 years. "The child who was singing, can you tell me about her situation?" Patricia looked surprised. Security personnel rarely asked about individual patients, and their protocols usually discouraged unnecessary interaction with hospital staff. But there was something in James's expression that made her decide to answer his question. "That's Emma Martinez," she said softly. 7 years old, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. She's been here for 3 weeks. She was supposed to meet the Queen today, but she had a fever spike and had to be isolated as a precaution. She's been asking about the royal visit all morning." James felt something shift in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was the image of his own daughter, Lucy, healthy and safe in Scotland. Perhaps it was the memory of Marcus and his warrior medicine poster, or the way the Queen's face had lit up when she spoke with the brave children they had just met. Or perhaps it was simply the pure sweetness of that young voice singing about rainbows and bluebirds and dreams that came true. "Is she well enough for a very brief visit?" he asked. "I mean, medically safe?" Patricia studied his face carefully. In her 20 years of experience, she had developed a finely tuned sense for people's motivations, and something told her that this man was asking for reasons that had nothing to do with security protocols. "She's not contagious," Patricia said slowly. "The isolation is precautionary because her immune system is compromised. A brief visit with proper precautions wouldn't put her at risk." "Why are you asking?" James looked down the corridor where the royal party was waiting by the elevator. Queen Elizabeth was speaking with the hospital administrator, but in another moment they would be gone, and this opportunity would disappear forever. He thought about duty and protocol, about the rules that had governed his entire adult life, and about the 15 years he had spent protecting the royal family without ever once stepping outside the boundaries of his assigned role. Then, he thought about a 7-year-old girl singing herself through disappointment with the kind of courage that most adults could never muster. "Because," James said quietly, "I think there's someone the Queen should meet." What happened next would later be described by witnesses in slightly different ways, but everyone agreed on the essential facts. James Robertson, Sergeant Major in the Queen's Guard, walked quickly but respectfully to where Queen Elizabeth was standing and requested a private word. The Queen, who had worked with James for several years and trusted his judgment implicitly, stepped aside to hear what he had to say. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. James spoke in the low, respectful tone he always used when addressing Her Majesty, but there was an urgency in his voice that was completely out of character for the usually unflappable security officer. He explained about Emma, about her illness, about her disappointment at missing the royal visit, and about the voice he had heard singing through the isolation ward door. Queen Elizabeth II had not remained on the throne for over 60 years by being inflexible or by ignoring good advice when it came from trusted sources. She had also not spent decades visiting hospitals and meeting sick children without developing a deep understanding of what those encounters meant to young patients and their families. When James finished speaking, she was quiet for a moment, considering the implications of what he was suggesting. Protocol dictated that the royal visit was over. The schedule called for departure, and security protocols discouraged unplanned interactions, especially in medical isolation areas. But the Queen had not built her reputation on blind adherence to protocol when human compassion called for flexibility. "Show me to her room," the Queen said simply. The walk back to Emma's room created a small stir among the hospital staff who had assumed the royal party was departing. Dr. Williams was hastily consulted about the safety of an isolation room visit, and she quickly confirmed that with proper precautions, there was no medical risk to either the Queen or the patient. Masks and hand sanitizer were provided, and Patricia led the unexpected visitors to Emma's door. Inside room 427, Emma Martinez was lying on her side, looking out the window at the courtyard where she could see the royal motorcade waiting in formation. She had stopped singing and was now just watching the rain create patterns on the glass, her small body curled under the hospital blankets with an exhaustion that seemed too heavy for someone so young. Sophia was sitting in the chair beside Emma's bed, working on some paperwork from Carlos's insurance company. She had been trying to stay positive all morning for Emma's sake, but her own disappointment at her daughter's missed opportunity was proving harder to hide as the day went on. When she heard voices in the corridor outside, she assumed it was the medical staff conducting their afternoon rounds. The soft knock on the door surprised them both. Patricia entered first, followed by a man in a dark suit who Sophia didn't recognize, and then by a small woman in a bright blue coat and matching hat who, despite the surgical mask covering part of her face, was unmistakably recognizable. Emma sat up in bed so quickly that she made herself dizzy. Sophia dropped her paperwork and stood up so fast that she knocked over her chair. For a moment, none of them could speak. "Hello, my dear," said Queen Elizabeth II, her voice warm and kind even through the mask. "I understand you've been having quite an adventure here in the hospital." The next 20 minutes would live in Emma's memory for the rest of her life, though she would often wonder if parts of it might have been a fever dream brought on by her treatment. The Queen sat in the chair beside Emma's bed and listened as the 7-year-old told her about Frederick IV Pole, about her warrior medicine battles, about missing her little brother Miguel, and about the letter she had written but couldn't deliver. Sophia produced the letter from Emma's bedside table, and the Queen read it carefully, asking questions about Emma's drawings and praising her artistic talent. They talked about Emma's favorite books, about the view from her hospital window, and about her plans for when she finished her treatment and could go home. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the visit was when Emma, with the fearlessness that children sometimes possess, asked the Queen if she ever got scared about doing her job. "Oh yes," the Queen replied without hesitation. "I think everyone gets frightened sometimes when they have important work to do. But I've learned that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what you need to do even when you are frightened." Emma nodded seriously, as if this was a piece of information she had been waiting her whole life to receive. When it came time for the Queen to leave, she stood beside Emma's bed and spoke words that would echo in the child's mind through every difficult treatment session that lay ahead. "You are one of the bravest warriors I have ever met," the Queen said. And I have met quite a few brave people in my time. You keep fighting your dragons, my dear, and remember that there are many people cheering you on." As the royal party finally departed, James Robertson walked beside the Queen toward the elevator. She was quiet for several steps, and then she spoke without looking at him. "That was the right thing to do, James. Thank you for reminding me that sometimes the most important moments are the ones that aren't on the schedule." "Your Majesty," James replied, "I think I learned more about courage in that room than I have in 15 years of royal service." Neither of them could have predicted that their decision to abandon protocol would soon become international news, or that Emma's story would touch people around the world in ways that would change not just her life, but the lives of countless other children facing their own battles with serious illness. The photograph appeared on the front page of every major British newspaper the following morning. It showed Queen Elizabeth II sitting beside a small girl in a hospital bed, both of them wearing surgical masks, their heads bent together over a piece of paper covered with colorful drawings. The image captured something that professional photographers spend their entire careers trying to achieve: a moment of genuine human connection that transcended titles, protocol, and circumstance. But the story behind the photograph was even more compelling than the image itself. When news broke that a member of the Queen's security detail had convinced Her Majesty to make an unscheduled visit to meet a 7-year-old cancer patient, it created a media sensation that reached far beyond the usual coverage of royal activities. The narrative of duty versus compassion, of a guard who chose humanity over protocol, resonated with people across the globe. Emma woke up the morning after the royal visit to discover that she had become famous overnight. Sophia showed her the newspaper coverage on a tablet that one of the nurses had brought to their room, and Emma stared in amazement at seeing her own face in the photographs. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive, focusing on her courage, her artistic talent, and the way she had charmed the Queen with her stories about warrior medicine and her friend Frederick. But fame, Emma quickly discovered, was a complicated gift for a 7-year-old fighting cancer. The hospital's phone system was overwhelmed with calls from media outlets requesting interviews, and the security staff had to manage an unexpected crowd of reporters and photographers gathered outside the main entrance. Dr. Williams met with the Martinez family to discuss how to handle the attention while protecting Emma's privacy and ensuring that her treatment remained the top priority. Carlos and Sophia were completely unprepared for the intensity of public interest in their daughter's story. Carlos had taken time off from both of his jobs to be at the hospital, and Sophia found herself fielding calls from journalists, producers, and well-meaning strangers who wanted to help or simply to express their support for Emma's fight against cancer. The family's small apartment, which had already felt empty without Emma and Miguel, now seemed to exist in a completely different world from the one they had inhabited just 48 hours earlier. James Robertson was experiencing his own version of unexpected fame, though his was more complicated and professionally challenging. The decision to approach the Queen about visiting Emma had been instinctive and heartfelt, but it had also been a clear violation of established security protocols. Royal protection procedures existed for important reasons, and deviations from standard operating procedures, no matter how well-intentioned, created potential risks that his supervisors were obligated to take seriously. The internal investigation into James's actions began within hours of the royal visit. He was temporarily reassigned from active protection duties while his commanding officers reviewed the incident and its implications. Some of his colleagues supported his decision, understanding the human motivations that had driven his choice, while others worried that emotional decision-making had no place in the high-stakes world of royal security. But public opinion was overwhelmingly on James's side. Letters of support poured into Buckingham Palace from people who saw his actions as heroic rather than insubordinate. Social media campaigns praised him for putting compassion before protocol, and several members of Parliament publicly commended his decision. The phrase "the guard who chose his heart" began trending on social media platforms, and his story became a powerful example of moral courage in action. Meanwhile, Emma's medical treatment continued with the same intensity and complexity that had characterized it from the beginning. The royal visit had provided an emotional boost that seemed to translate into improved physical resilience, but acute lymphoblastic leukemia remained a formidable opponent that required sustained medical intervention. Emma's response to the initial phase of chemotherapy had been positive, but her doctors explained to the family that successful treatment would require at least 2 more years of various treatment protocols. The publicity surrounding Emma's story had one immediate positive effect: it brought attention to childhood cancer research and treatment in a way that medical professionals had been trying to achieve for years. Donations to children's cancer charities increased dramatically in the week following the royal visit, and several research foundations reported significant upticks in both funding and volunteer applications from people who wanted to help children like Emma. Dr. Williams found herself fielding calls from medical colleagues around the world who were interested in Emma's case and the broader implications of the media attention it had received. Childhood cancer advocates saw an opportunity to leverage Emma's story into sustained support for research and family support programs. But they also understood the importance of protecting Emma's privacy and ensuring that her celebrity status didn't interfere with her medical care or her family's emotional well-being. 3 weeks after the royal visit, Emma was strong enough to leave the hospital for her first extended stay at home since her diagnosis. The transition was both joyful and anxiety-provoking for the entire family. Sophia had to learn to manage Emma's complex medication schedule, recognize signs of infection or complications, and navigate the logistical challenges of regular outpatient treatment appointments while maintaining some semblance of normal family life. Miguel had grown during the month that Emma was hospitalized, and the reunion between the siblings was emotional for everyone involved. The 4-year-old had developed his own way of understanding his sister's illness, explaining to anyone who would listen that Emma was a superhero who took special medicine to fight bad guys that lived in her blood. His uncomplicated acceptance of Emma's changed appearance and limited energy was both heartbreaking and inspiring for his parents. The apartment felt different with Emma home. Medical equipment occupied space in the living room, and the family's daily routine now revolved around treatment schedules and energy levels rather than work and school commitments. Emma's room had been modified with an air purifier and special bedding designed to reduce infection risks, and visitors were limited to immediate family members and a few close friends who followed strict health protocols. But there were also moments of profound normalcy that reminded the Martinez family that they were still the same people they had been before cancer entered their lives. Emma still loved to draw and create elaborate stories about the characters in her artwork. She still asked endless questions about everything she observed, though her questions now included sophisticated inquiries about medical procedures and treatment protocols. She still laughed at Miguel's silly jokes and helped her mother fold laundry when she had enough energy. 1 month after the royal visit, an envelope arrived at their apartment that changed everything once again. The return address was Buckingham Palace, and inside was a handwritten letter from Queen Elizabeth II, personally addressed to Emma. The letter was brief but warm, asking about Emma's progress and expressing continued admiration for her courage. But the most significant part of the letter was the Queen's invitation for Emma and her family to visit Buckingham Palace when Emma's treatment schedule permitted. The invitation created a new wave of media attention, but this time the Martinez family was better prepared to manage the publicity. They had learned to set boundaries with journalists and to prioritize Emma's health and privacy above public curiosity about their story. Sophia had also connected with other families of childhood cancer patients, and their advice about maintaining normalcy while dealing with public attention proved invaluable. Emma's reaction to the royal invitation was characteristically practical. She wanted to know if she could bring Frederick, her four-pole, to meet the Queen's dogs, and whether the palace had good windows for looking at clouds. When Sophia explained that Emma might not need Frederick by the time they could visit the palace, Emma considered this possibility with the same serious attention she gave to all questions about her future health. The invitation also prompted renewed interest in James Robertson's story. Follow-up articles revealed that he had been officially reprimanded for his breach of protocol, but that the Queen herself had intervened to ensure that his career was not permanently damaged by his decision to prioritize compassion over procedure. He had been reassigned to a different department within the royal household, where his experience and judgment were valued in a role that allowed for more flexibility in decision-making. In interviews, James consistently deflected attention from his own actions and redirected focus to Emma's courage and the broader issues surrounding childhood cancer. He had been profoundly affected by his brief interaction with Emma and her family, and he spoke eloquently about how their strength had challenged his own understanding of what constituted true bravery. "I spent 15 years thinking that courage meant following orders and maintaining discipline," he told one reporter. "But that little girl taught me that real courage sometimes means knowing when the rules matter less than the human being standing in front of you." As Emma's story continued to unfold in the public eye, it became clear that the impact of that unscheduled royal visit extended far beyond one child's hospital experience. The incident had started important conversations about the balance between institutional protocol and individual compassion, about the power of small acts of kindness to create significant change, and about the responsibility of people in positions of authority to use their influence for the benefit of others. Emma's medical team reported that her response to treatment continued to be positive, though they cautioned that successful outcomes in childhood leukemia were measured in years rather than months. The combination of aggressive chemotherapy, supportive care, and Emma's own remarkable resilience had created a treatment trajectory that gave her doctors reason for cautious optimism about her long-term prognosis. But perhaps the most significant development was the relationship that had formed between Emma and Queen Elizabeth through their correspondence. The Queen's letters arrived regularly, always handwritten and always focused on Emma's interests and experiences rather than her illness. Emma's responses, dictated to Sophia when she was too tired to write herself, were filled with observations about her daily life, questions about royal protocols, and updates on her ongoing battles with what she had started calling her invisible dragons. The correspondence revealed something that the initial media coverage had not fully captured: the depth of genuine connection that had formed between a 7-year-old cancer patient and the British monarch. Their letters discussed everything from favorite books to the challenges of public life, from the beauty of palace gardens to the importance of finding courage during difficult times. Emma's story had become a symbol of hope for families dealing with childhood cancer, but it was also something more complex and personal. It was the story of how one moment of human connection could ripple outward to touch countless lives, how an act of protocol-breaking compassion could remind an entire nation of the values that truly mattered, and how a brave child's fight against cancer could teach adults about the power of hope, courage, and love in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. As Emma prepared for the next phase of her treatment and looked forward to her eventual visit to Buckingham Palace, she carried with her the knowledge that she had already accomplished something remarkable. She had shown the world that courage came in many forms, that kindness could triumph over protocol, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with swords or shields, but with hope, determination, and the unwavering love of people who refused to let you fight alone. 6 months had passed since Emma Martinez first heard Queen Elizabeth II's voice through a surgical mask, and the world had changed in ways both dramatic and subtle. Emma's hair had begun to grow back, appearing first as soft fuzz that reminded Sophia of the way Emma had looked as a baby, then gradually developing into short, dark curls that caught the light differently than her original hair had. The new hair seemed to symbolize Emma's overall transformation. She was recognizably the same child, but there was something fundamentally different about her presence in the world. The invitation to visit Buckingham Palace had remained open throughout Emma's treatment, with Queen Elizabeth's staff maintaining regular contact with the Martinez family to coordinate a visit when Emma's health and energy levels could support the experience. That moment finally arrived on a crisp October morning when Dr. Williams declared Emma stable enough for the carefully planned excursion that had been months in the making. Emma had spent weeks preparing for the palace visit with the same methodical attention she brought to all her important endeavors. She had researched palace history, practiced her curtsy until she could execute it without losing her balance, and prepared a list of questions that ranged from practical inquiries about the Queen's daily routine to wonderfully childlike curiosities about whether the royal corgis were allowed on the furniture. Carlos had requested time off from both of his jobs, an arrangement that was made possible by the financial support that had flowed in from people around the world who had been moved by Emma's story. The family's economic situation had stabilized considerably due to donations, fundraising efforts, and a trust fund that had been established to help with Emma's ongoing medical expenses. For the first time since Emma's diagnosis, Sophia and Carlos could focus entirely on their daughter's health without the constant stress of financial insecurity. Miguel, now 5 years old and more articulate about his understanding of his sister's illness, had been included in the palace invitation. His excitement about meeting Emma's friend the Queen provided a source of joy and normalcy that helped balance the weight of the occasion. Miguel had his own questions prepared, mostly centered around whether the palace had a good playground and whether the Queen would like to see his collection of toy dinosaurs. James Robertson had also been invited to attend the palace visit, a gesture that acknowledged his role in creating the original connection between Emma and the Queen. His professional situation had stabilized in the months following his breach of protocol, and he had found meaningful work in a new position that allowed him to use his security expertise while having more flexibility to exercise human judgment in his decision-making. The relationship between James and his own daughter Lucy had deepened significantly as a result of his experience with Emma. The incident had prompted him to re-evaluate his priorities and to make changes in his work schedule that allowed him to spend more time with Lucy. His weekend visits to Scotland had expanded into longer stays, and he had begun to understand that the most important protection he could provide was emotional presence rather than professional distance. On the morning of the palace visit, Emma woke up earlier than usual, not because of excitement alone, but because she had developed the habit of rising early to accommodate her treatment schedule and to make the most of her higher energy levels in the morning hours. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a blue dress that Sophia had bought specifically for the occasion, paired with comfortable shoes that would allow her to walk through the palace without becoming too tired. The drive to Buckingham Palace took place in a vehicle provided by the royal household, a consideration that eliminated the stress of navigating London traffic and allowed the Martinez family to approach their destination without the complications that public transportation might have presented. Emma spent the journey looking out the windows and asking questions about the buildings and landmarks they passed, her curiosity about the world around her undiminished by everything she had experienced. When they arrived at the palace gates, Emma experienced a moment of overwhelm that was completely understandable given the magnitude of the moment. The building was larger and more imposing than she had imagined, despite all her research and preparation. Sophia held Emma's hand as they were escorted through security procedures that were more thorough than anything the family had previously experienced, but which were conducted with a gentleness that acknowledged Emma's age and medical situation. The reunion between Emma and Queen Elizabeth took place in a private sitting room that managed to be both elegant and comfortable, with windows that provided natural light and chairs that were appropriately sized for conversation between adults and children. The Queen greeted Emma as if she were welcoming an old friend rather than receiving a formal visitor, and their conversation picked up naturally from the themes that had characterized their written correspondence over the previous months. Emma presented the Queen with a gift she had been working on for weeks, a hand-drawn book that told the story of their first meeting from Emma's perspective. The artwork showed the hospital room, Frederick IV Pole, and the magical moment when a real queen had appeared to talk about courage and warrior medicine. The Queen studied each page carefully and asked questions about Emma's artistic choices, treating the gift with the same attention she might have given to a state document. Miguel's interaction with the Queen revealed the same unself-conscious directness that had characterized Emma's original hospital encounter. He showed the Queen his dinosaur collection and explained his theory that dinosaurs would have made excellent palace guards because they were very big and had loud roars. The Queen listened to his presentation with apparent seriousness and asked several follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest in his ideas. The palace tour that followed was modified to accommodate Emma's energy levels and medical needs, but it included highlights that had been specifically chosen based on her interests and curiosities. She saw the throne room, the state dining room, and the portrait gallery, where she spent considerable time studying paintings of previous monarchs and asking questions about their stories and their challenges. But perhaps the most meaningful part of the visit was the informal time Emma spent in the Queen's private study, surrounded by photographs, books, and personal mementos that provided glimpses into the human side of royal life. Emma had prepared questions about the balance between public duties and private interests, and the Queen's answers revealed a thoughtful perspective on service, responsibility, and the importance of maintaining personal connections even within the constraints of public life. "The most important thing I've learned," the Queen told Emma, "is that caring about people isn't something you do in addition to your job, it is the job. Everything else is just details and procedures." Emma nodded seriously, understanding that this was the kind of wisdom she would need to remember long after their conversation ended. James Robertson's presence at the palace visit provided an opportunity to discuss how his decision to prioritize human compassion over institutional protocol had affected his life and career. In conversation with Emma's parents, he reflected on the ways that one moment of moral clarity had led to positive changes not just in his professional situation, but in his relationship with his own daughter and his understanding of what constituted meaningful work. "Emma taught me that courage isn't about following rules," he explained to Sophia and Carlos. "It's about knowing when something matters more than the rules. That's a lesson I've carried into every part of my life." The visit concluded with Emma receiving several gifts that reflected the Queen's attention to her interests and personality. There was a leather-bound journal for her writing and drawing, a selection of books about British history written for young readers, and a small silver locket that contained a photograph of their first meeting in the hospital. But the most precious gift was intangible, the continued friendship and correspondence that the Queen promised to maintain as Emma continued her treatment and recovery. As the Martinez family prepared to leave the palace, Emma asked if she could write one more letter to the Queen. Using palace stationery and a fountain pen that required careful handling, she wrote a brief note that captured both her gratitude and her understanding of the significance of their relationship. "Dear Queen Elizabeth," she wrote in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, "thank you for teaching me that being brave means being kind to people even when it's not easy. I promise to remember that forever. Your friend, Emma the Warrior Princess." The palace visit marked a turning point in Emma's treatment journey, though not because of any dramatic medical development. Instead, it represented a moment when Emma fully understood that her illness had connected her to something larger than her own individual experience. Her story had touched people around the world, created conversations about compassion and courage, and demonstrated the power of human connection to transcend institutional boundaries and social hierarchies. In the months that followed the palace visit, Emma's medical progress continued to be positive. Her response to treatment remained strong, and her doctors began to express cautious optimism about her long-term prognosis. The combination of excellent medical care, family support, and Emma's own remarkable resilience had created a trajectory toward recovery that exceeded many of the early projections about her case. But Emma's impact extended far beyond her individual medical outcome. The story of her meeting with Queen Elizabeth had inspired changes in hospital policies regarding royal visits and celebrity interactions with pediatric patients. Several hospitals had modified their protocols to allow for more flexibility in arranging meaningful encounters between public figures and young patients, recognizing that such connections could provide psychological and emotional benefits that complemented medical treatment. James Robertson had become a sought-after speaker at conferences about leadership, ethics, and organizational culture. His story provided a compelling case study in moral courage and the importance of maintaining human perspective within institutional frameworks. He consistently used these speaking opportunities to redirect attention to childhood cancer research and to encourage others to find ways to prioritize compassion in their own professional contexts. Emma's correspondence with Queen Elizabeth continued throughout her treatment, evolving into a friendship that provided both participants with insights into resilience, service, and the ways that personal connections could transcend differences in age, background, and circumstances. The Queen's letters offered Emma guidance about handling public attention, maintaining privacy, and using influence responsibly, while Emma's responses provided the Queen with reminders about the power of hope, curiosity, and determination in facing life's challenges. 2 years after her initial diagnosis, Emma Martinez was declared to be in complete remission. The announcement came during a routine appointment that had begun like many others, with blood tests and physical examinations that had become familiar parts of Emma's regular routine. But Dr. Williams's smile was different that day, and her words carried a weight that transformed everything. "The cancer cells are gone," she told Emma and Sophia. "All of them. Your treatment has been successful, and, while we'll continue monitoring you regularly for several more years, you can now begin planning for a future that doesn't revolve around hospital visits and chemotherapy schedules." Emma's first question was whether she could finally hug Miguel without worrying about infection risks. Her second question was whether she could write to the Queen to share the good news. Her third question was whether she could visit James Robertson and his daughter Lucy, who had become pen pals during Emma's treatment and had developed their own friendship based on their shared experiences as children whose lives had been changed by their father's decisions to prioritize compassion over convention. The celebration of Emma's remission became an international news story, but it was also a deeply personal moment for a family that had spent 2 years learning to balance hope with realism, public attention with private healing, and normal childhood experiences with the extraordinary circumstances that had shaped their lives. Emma's recovery represented not just the triumph of medical science and family love, but also the power of human connection to provide strength during the most challenging times. Emma Martinez, now 9 years old and cancer-free, had become living proof that courage could take many forms, that kindness could triumph over protocol, and that sometimes the most important battles were won not through force or strategy, but through hope, determination, and the willingness of people to choose love over fear. Her story would continue to inspire others for years to come, but for Emma herself, the greatest victory was simply the opportunity to grow up, to dream about her future, and to use her experience to help other children find their own courage when facing their own invisible dragons. The bond between a brave child, a compassionate guard, and a wise queen had created ripples that touched countless lives, proving that sometimes the most powerful forces for good in the world were not grand gestures or institutional programs, but simple moments of human connection that reminded everyone involved of what truly mattered in life.